My name is Lauren Ross, and I am 29 years old. For 3 years, I was the silent engine behind the architectural design division at Vanguard Structural Group in downtown Chicago. If you walk past the riverfront or look up at the new steel and glass towers anchoring the West Loop, you are looking at my hands. You are looking at the nights I spent hunched over my drafting table until the cleaning crew clicked off the hallway lights, tracing the load-bearing paths of cantilevers and calculating the wind load deflections of structural columns. I didn't mind the anonymity at first. I believed in the work. I believed that structural steel didn't care about a title and that an accurate schematic was its own reward. But last week, my manager stood in a gilded ballroom on the top floor of the Ritz-Carlton, holding a crystal award and accepting a promotion to Senior Vice President of Creative Assets based entirely on a 300-page design portfolio she didn't write. She stole my blueprints, wiped my digital signature from the title blocks, and claimed the multi-million-dollar anchor project for the city's largest development firm as her own personal masterpiece. She stood at that podium in a tailored cream silk suit, her diamonds catching the stage lights, smiling with that practiced boardroom warmth that looks like mentorship, but feels like a closed door. She didn't look at the back row where I was sitting in my off-the-rack gray blazer, my fingers clenching my notebook so hard the wire spiral bent out of shape. She thought she had surgically excised me from my own career. She thought she had left me in the copy room to rot. But she forgot one fundamental law of architecture. You cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of air. And tomorrow morning, during an emergency session with our principal client, the German logistics conglomerate that is funding the $92 million corporate campus, she is going to stand at the head of a walnut conference table and try to explain an integrated geometric truss system that she cannot even spell. Before we get into the blueprints of how it all unraveled, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with your own sense of justice. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. I want to know exactly where you are listening from as we pull the structural pins out of this corporate deception. To understand how my manager, Victoria Vance, managed to hijack my career, we have to go back to the winter of 2024. Vanguard Structural Group was a mid-tier firm trying desperately to break into the old money client lists of the Midwest. My father had been a structural welder for 40 years. He used to come home smelling of iron filings and industrial grease, his hands permanently stained with graphite. He taught me to look at a building not as a decorative shape, but as an ongoing argument with gravity. When I got my master in architectural engineering from Illinois Tech, he bought me a professional drafting parallel ruler that I still keep on my desk. He told me that a good line doesn't lie, and that a structural calculation doesn't care about who has the loudest voice at dinner. Vanguard was managed by old-school executives who valued two things above all else: pedigree and obedience. Victoria Vance delivered both flawlessly. She was 38, held an interior styling certificate from a boutique school in Switzerland, and had a father who sat on the board of 3 regional banks. She didn't know the difference between a tension tie and a compression strut, but she knew exactly how to talk to institutional investors at charity galas. She wore $400 shoes that never had a speck of drywall dust on them, and her office always smelled of expensive jasmine tea and fresh-cut lilies. When she hired me, she looked at my portfolio of structural calculations and said, "You have a very dense style, Lauren. It's practical. We need someone to handle the heavy lifting while I focus on the holistic vision." I was 26 then. I thought holistic vision meant collaboration. I thought she was the bridge between my raw calculations and the corporate clients who didn't want to look at finite element analysis models. For 2 years, I fed her ammunition. Every blueprint, every complex spatial diagram, every innovative materials spec. I handed them across her desk in neat manila folders, grateful for a brief nod or a line in my annual review that said I was highly adaptive. The shift happened when the Chicago Riverline project went out for bid. It was the holy grail of the 2026 commercial calendar, a 3-tower corporate campus spanning 6 acres of prime riverfront land, funded by a European logistics giant called the Crossan Corporation. The principal client was a man named Dieter Crossan, a 3rd-generation structural engineer who had turned his family's shipping company into a multi-billion-dollar empire. He didn't want a pretty glass box. He wanted an architectural marvel that integrated sustainable steel with a radical, open-concept cantilevered atrium that hovered over the river itself. Victoria called me into her office on a Thursday evening in November. The room was dark except for the low glow of her desk lamp, which cast long, sharp shadows across the white leather chairs. "Lauren," she said, setting her gold-rimmed teacup down on a porcelain coaster. "The Crossan bid is falling apart. The design team's proposals are too conventional. Dieter Crossan rejected 3 of our concepts this morning. He says Vanguard lacks structural courage." I stood across from her desk, my portfolio tucked under my arm. "I have a concept," I said quietly. "I've been working on it for 4 months on weekends. It utilizes an asymmetrical geometric truss system that transfers the entire dead load of the atrium back into the primary concrete core. It allows for a 300-foot open span without a single vertical support column." Victoria's eyes narrowed. It was the quick, calculating look behind the eyes that I had learned to watch for, the micro-adjustment of a woman who sees an asset she hasn't logged yet. "Show me," she said. I spread out my schematics across her marble desk. I showed her the flowcharts of structural stress, the diagrams of force distribution, and the parallel lines of the cantilever layout. I had spent 80 hours on the mathematics alone, balancing equations to ensure that the wind-shear forces off Lake Michigan wouldn't cause structural fatigue in the welded joints. Victoria didn't look at the math. She looked at the rendering I had drawn by hand. A sweeping, aggressive wedge of steel that cut through the Chicago skyline like the bow of a ship. "This is interesting," she said, her finger tracing the edge of the cantilever. "It's chaotic, but it has a specific rhythm. Leave the files with me, Lauren. I need to re-render these into a format that the executive board can actually digest. Don't mention this to the rest of the floor. If the design team thinks we are going over their heads, it will cause unnecessary friction." I left her office at 9:00 p.m. I walked to the subway station through a cold, spitting sleet, my hands frozen inside my pockets, but my chest felt light. I thought my manager was finally seeing me. I thought my architectural vision was going to save the firm. I didn't know that she had already opened her laptop, loaded a file-stripping software, and begun the process of erasing my name from every single digital layer of the Crossan presentation. By January of 2026, the Crossan Corporation had officially awarded Vanguard Structural Group the contract. It was a $92 million win that instantly put our firm on the national map. The announcement was made in the main lobby of Vanguard Tower, amidst champagne flutes and catering trays of smoked salmon. The senior partners stood on a temporary stage, their arms wrapped around Victoria Vance. "To the creative architect of our future," the managing partner shouted over the applause. "Victoria Vance has delivered the most structurally audacious design this city has seen in 30 years. I stood near the service entrance by the coffee machine, a paper cup of lukewarm dark roast in my hand. I watched Victoria step to the microphone. She was wearing a midnight blue velvet blazer with silver buttons, her hair pinned up in a flawless chignon. She didn't look at the design pool. She didn't look at me. "Thank you," she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, practiced register that exudes old money confidence. "When I conceived the riverfront cantilever, I knew we had to reject traditional Midwestern box structures. I wanted to design something that argued with gravity itself. It took months of solitary drafting, of balancing the geometric tensions in the middle of the night, but we proved that Vanguard can lead the world." The room erupted. My college roommate, Megan, who worked in our marketing department, turned to me with her brow furrowed. "Lauren, didn't you show me a sketch exactly like that in October? The ship bow wedge over the water." "It's a common architectural motif," I said, my voice flat, my throat closing around the lie. "No, it isn't," Megan whispered, her eyes shifting from Victoria back to my face. "That truss configuration has your exact geometric spacing. Lauren, did she take your files?" "I left them with her for review," I said. Megan let out a sharp, quiet breath. "You idiot. You handed her a multi-million-dollar portfolio without a watermarked backup." I walked back to my cubicle before the speech finished. I sat at my computer and opened the shared project server. My heart was knocking against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clicked into the Crossan project folder, then into the subdirectory marked *approved schematics*. I opened the master PDF of the architectural layout. The 300-page document was beautiful. Every line I had traced with my father's parallel ruler was there. Every calculation of wind deflection, every stress diagram for the grade 70 structural steel plates, every single footnote regarding the thermal expansion of the concrete anchors. It was exactly as I had written it, but the title blocks had been completely redrawn. Where my name, *L, Ross, lead architectural engineer *, had been stamped on the original drafts, there was now a clean, laser-printed block that read, V. Vance, Senior Director of Creative Concepts. I checked the metadata of the files. The author field had been wiped. The edit history had been flattened into a single, untrackable master layer created by Victoria's user profile on December 24th, Christmas Eve, while I was 40 miles away in a small living room, watching my father clean his welding goggles and telling him that my designs were finally going to be built. I sat in my cubicle for 20 minutes, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses. The office around me was silent. The corporate staff was still downstairs drinking Vanguard's champagne. I opened my personal desk drawer and reached for the mahogany box where I kept my father's parallel ruler. My fingers touched the polished wood. There are two options when a structure is compromised. You can let it collapse under the weight of the deception, or you can climb up the framework and see exactly which pin is holding the fraud together. I chose to climb. I didn't file a complaint with HR. Vanguard's HR department was run by a woman who played tennis with Victoria's sister every Saturday morning, an anonymous administrative assistant complaining about a senior director's file ownership would be treated as an act of standard corporate jealousy. I didn't confront Victoria in her office. If I tipped her off, she would have 3 weeks to hire an outside consulting engineer to explain the mathematics to her before the client meetings began. Instead, I went to work. For the next 3 weeks, I became the most cooperative assistant Victoria Vance had ever seen. I printed her schedules, I bound her portfolio booklets, and I ensured that every single layout page was razor-sharp for the upcoming executive review. I didn't fix the subtle, hidden complexity in the structural math, the specific geometric anomaly in the third cantilever calculation that required an intuitive understanding of torque distribution. I left it exactly as it was. It was a beautiful, airtight calculation, but it was written in a mathematical dialect that Victoria Vance couldn't read if her life depended on it. The Vanguard corporate gala was held on a Saturday night in late April at the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom. 300 people filled the room under crystal chandeliers that turned the silk gowns and tailored tuxedos into a shifting sea of gold and silver light. This was Victoria Vance's coronation. The regional papers had already run a feature on the Crossan Riverline project, calling her the woman who reshaped the loop. I stood near the back of the room by the dessert tables, wearing a simple black dress I had bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack. My heels were pinching my toes, and the ambient noise of 300 executives clinking wine glasses was giving me a dull ache right between my eyes. My mother had been a bookkeeper before she passed away. She used to tell me that old money doesn't look at price tags, but they always count the change. The people in this room were counting the prestige, and Victoria was the currency of the night. At 8:30 p.m., the managing partner stepped to the podium. "Tonight, we honor an elite achievement in structural design. Vanguard has secured its legacy for the next decade, and that legacy belongs to one visionary mind." The spotlight swept across the floor, finding Victoria at table 1. She rose, her cream silk dress catching the prismatic light of the chandeliers, her diamond earrings shaking as she walked toward the stage. The applause was a solid wall of sound. "I am proud to announce," the partner continued, his voice booming through the speakers, "that effective immediately, Victoria Vance has been elevated to Senior Vice President of Creative Assets, with an independent equity share in the firm's future developments." Victoria took the Crystal Award. She stood at that microphone and looked out over the room with that serene, undisputed confidence of someone who has never had to scrub carbon grease out of her nails. "Architecture is not about numbers," she said, her voice echoing off the gilded molding of the ballroom ceiling. "It's about courage. When I looked at the riverfront site, I didn't see a zoning restriction. I saw a canvas. I want to thank the board for trusting my solitary vision, and I promise that this is only the first spire Vanguard will raise into the clouds." I didn't applaud. I stood by the chocolate fondue station, my portfolio folder clutched against my side like a shield, watching her bask in a standing ovation that belonged to my father's daughter. "Lauren," a voice said behind me. I turned. It was Dieter Crossen. He was 62, with a close-cropped silver beard, heavy-rimmed German reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket, and a posture that looked like he spent his mornings inspecting bridge anchorages. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a dark charcoal woolen suit that looked functional, almost industrial, despite the obvious quality of the cut. He was holding a glass of mineral water with a slice of lime. "Mr. Crossen," I said, straightening my spine. "You are the assistant from the Vance office," he said, his English precise, with that dry North German cadence that strips the fluff out of every sentence. "You are the one who delivered the secondary stress models to my legal team last week." "Yes, sir, Lauren Ross." He took a slow sip of his water, his eyes tracking Victoria as she stepped off the stage, surrounded by senior partners. "The portfolio is impressive, Miss Ross. The ship-bow cantilever is a very bold argument with the riverbank. But when I read the structural annex on page 240, I see a specific style of calculation. It is very dense, very traditional in its mathematical rigor." "Is there an issue with the torque distribution models, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice level, my eyes locked on his. Dieter Crossen lowered his glass. A faint, sharp glint appeared behind his heavy-rimmed glasses. "No, the math is flawless. It looks like it was written by someone who has spent 20 years watching steel being welded under pressure. It does not look like it was written by a woman who talks about canvases and solitary vision on a television program." He looked at me for 3 long seconds. The orchestra began playing a waltz in the corner, the sound of the violins muffled by the chatter of the crowd. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Crossen said, his voice dropping into a quiet, executive register that cut through the music. "We have the final technical sign-off in the Vanguard boardroom. I have some specific questions about the asymmetrical load transfers on the 3rd tower. I am told Miss Vance will be presenting the structural defense personally." "She is the senior vice president, sir," I replied. "Yes," Crossen said, his lips twisting into a small, humorless smile. "She is. I will see you in the room, Miss Ross. Bring your original drafting pencils. I think we may need to redraw a few lines before the contract is signed." He walked away before I could respond, his charcoal suit cutting through the silk-dressed crowd like a shadow. I stood by the table, my hand trembling just slightly as I reached for my glass. The countdown had begun, 12 hours until the technical sign-off. Victoria Vance had her Crystal Award, her new title, and her equity share. But tomorrow morning, she was going to have to walk into a room with a 3rd-generation German engineer who knew exactly what a line looked like when it was drawn by a fraud. The executive floor of Vanguard Structural Group at 7:45 a.m. smelled of industrial carpet cleaner, high-end wood polish, and the ozone hum of heavy-duty copiers running wide open. The storm had not yet hit the glass windows of the 42nd floor, but the air felt heavy, compressed, like the atmospheric drop right before a tornado tears through a prairie county. I badged through the security turnstiles carrying a fresh box of standard blue-line plotter paper and my father's mahogany box. I didn't stop at the communal kitchen. I didn't need the casual morning gossip about who had drank too much Pinot Noir at the Ritz-Carlton or whose husband had been spotted arguing with a managing partner near the valet stand. I went straight to the master conference room. The room was an oval of polished walnut that stretched 40 feet toward a floor-to-ceiling panoramic view of the Chicago River. The chairs were black Italian leather, deep and silent, designed to absorb the weight of men who controlled pension funds and municipal zoning boards. I began setting up the room. I laid out 12 copies of the 300-page Crossan portfolio, aligning the black leather binders precisely 2 inches from the edge of the table. I placed a sharpened Vanguard monogrammed pencil beside each pad of grid paper. At 8:15 a.m., the door swung open. Victoria Vance walked in, her heels clicking against the marble border of the room with a rapid, aggressive cadence that contradicted the calculated serenity of her outfit. She was wearing a structured, double-breasted pantsuit in charcoal wool, a cream silk shell underneath, and a platinum brooch shaped like an architectural compass pinned to her lapel. Her hair was immaculate, a sharp, asymmetrical bob that didn't have a single strand out of place. But she was carrying her leather portfolio like a weapon, her fingers white around the handle. "Lauren," she said, her voice dropping into that tight, administrative register she used when she was running behind schedule. "Why isn't the digital projection system synced to the Crossan master drive yet? The IT department said the server migration was completed at midnight." "I'm loading the local vector files now, Victoria," I said, not looking up from my laptop terminal. "Dieter Crossan requested raw CAD layers instead of pre-rendered slides. He wants to manipulate the structural nodes in real time during the stress defense." Victoria stopped mid-stride. The leather portfolio hit the walnut table with a dull, heavy thud. "Raw layers? Why wasn't I informed of this change? The marketing presentation was explicitly designed around the localized three-dimensional modeling." "Mr. Crossan texted the managing partner at 6:00 this morning," I replied, keeping my voice flat, rhythmic, entirely devoid of inflection. "He stated that he didn't join us to look at digital watercolors. He wants to see the finite element analysis models for the third tower's cantilever base." I watched the skin around Victoria's jaw tighten. A tiny muscle near her left ear gave a single, sharp twitch. She opened her portfolio, pulling out a stack of laminated index cards, her script for the presentation. I could see the highlighted phrases from my own technical brief written in her elegant, looping handwriting: asymmetrical counterbalance, load-bearing core integration, zero-point stress distribution. She had memorized the vocabulary words like a child preparing for a spelling bee. But she had no idea that the language she was trying to speak had an entirely different syntax. "Get the files up," she snapped, turning toward the window, her hand coming up to touch the platinum compass on her lapel. "And ensure you are seated behind me with the original calculation spreadsheets open. If Crossan asks for the specific regional material codes for the steel plate tempering, I want the numbers whispered to me before he finishes the sentence. Am I clear?" "Perfectly clear, Victoria," I said. I clicked the upload button on my console. The screen behind her flared into life, illuminating the dark walnut room with the raw, glowing skeletal outline of a $92 million masterpiece. The lines were pure, blue, and unyielding. The foundation was set. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked open. Dieter Crossan walked in first, flanked by his chief legal counsel, a sharp-faced German woman named Elsa Brandt, and 2 junior structural analysts who looked like they lived inside a wind tunnel simulation lab. The managing partners of Vanguard followed behind them, their faces flushed with that eager, aggressive hospitality that corporate executives exhibit when they are 45 minutes away from closing a deal that will secure their third-quarter bonuses. "Dieter, excellent morning," the managing partner, Richard Croft, boomed, extending a hand. "The hospitality suite at the Ritz was up to standard, I trust. We are completely prepared to finalize the structural writers today. Victoria has compiled the complete engineering annex." Crossan didn't take the hand. He gave a brief, efficient nod and took his seat at the center of the oval table, directly across from the massive projection screen. He pulled his heavy-rimmed German reading glasses from his breast pocket, slipped them onto his nose, and didn't look at the leather binders or the monogrammed pencils. He looked straight at the blue vector lines of the shipbow cantilever hovering over the virtual Chicago River. "We skipped the breakfast chat, Richard," Crossan said, his voice a low, dry rasp that stripped the corporate warmth out of the room instantly. "The weather is gray, the lake is rough, and I have a flight back to Frankfurt at 2 o'clock. Let us talk about the geometry of the third tower. Richard Croft blinked, his smile freezing for a fraction of a second before he turned to Victoria. Of course, visionary design requires visionary defense. Victoria, the floor is yours. Victoria rose from her leather chair with that fluid, aristocratic grace that had won her a standing ovation 12 hours earlier. She adjusted her charcoal jacket, picked up her gold-plated pointer, and smiled directly into Crossan's gray eyes. "Thank you, Dieter," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of executive authority. "When I sat down to resolve the spatial constraints of the third tower, I recognized that traditional engineering would fail the site. The Crossan campus required an act of structural courage. By utilizing an asymmetrical geometric truss system, I have eliminated the need for vertical support columns along the river wall, transferring the entire vertical load back into the core via a localized distribution matrix." She paused, waiting for Crossan to nod. He didn't move. He sat with his chin resting in his palm, staring at the screen. "Go to page 242 of the structural annex," Crossan said, his voice entirely flat. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but her pointer finger shifted 2 inches to the left. "The rendering on page 200. "Not the rendering," Crossan interrupted, his tone sharpening like a lathe cutting through soft pine. "The math. Look at equation 3.14, the torque deflection calculation for the primary welded gusset plates." Victoria blinked. She looked down at the highlighted index cards in her hand, her thumb rubbing the edge of the cardboard so hard the cream paper began to fray. The torque deflection is balanced via the high-tensile alloy specifications, Dieter. We have selected grade 70 steel to ensure that the structural fatigue models remain within standard parameters. "Grade 70 steel is a material specification, Miss Vance," Crossan said, leaning forward, his elbows hitting the walnut table with a sharp sound. "I am asking you about the variable load equation. The formula on the screen shows a nonlinear coefficient for the lakefront wind shear. Explain to me how that coefficient correlates with the dead load of the open concept atrium when the temperature drops below 0. The boardroom went completely silent. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the HVAC system behind the ceiling tiles. Richard Croft cleared his throat, his eyes shifting from Crossan to Victoria with a sudden, anxious focus. "Victoria," Croft said, his voice dropping an octave, "walk Dieter through the coefficient derivation." Victoria stood frozen under the LED spotlight of the presentation screen. The blue lines of the structural matrix reflected off her charcoal suit, painting her in a lattice of geometric patterns she couldn't explain. She looked back at me, her eyes wide, wild, a silent, frantic command flashing behind her pupils. "Fix this. Give me the answer. Now." I sat behind her, my hands folded over my leather notebook. I didn't whisper a single digit. I didn't slide a piece of paper across the walnut veneer. I met her gaze with the absolute, unblinking calm of a structural wall under 0-pint load. I gave her nothing. I believe that specific calculation was handled during our secondary verification phase," Victoria stammered, her voice losing its smooth, alpine silkiness, cracking on the consonants. "Our engineering pool compiled the regional wind data to ensure the matrix." "Miss Vance," Dieter Crossan said, standing up from his chair. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it filled the 40-foot room like a concrete pour. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a red drafting marker, and walked directly to the projection screen. He drew a sharp, aggressive circle around the nonlinear coefficient node at the base of the cantilever. "This equation was not compiled by an engineering pool," Crossan said, turning to face the Vanguard executive board. "This equation is written in the precise mathematical style of the Illinois Tech Structural Lab. It is a highly intuitive, radical solution that balances torsional stress by manipulating the geometric cross-sections of the truss itself. It is a masterpiece of architectural engineering." He walked back to the table, his eyes passing over Victoria as if she were a piece of clear plexiglass. He stopped directly in front of my chair. And the woman who stands at that podium cannot even explain the difference between a coefficient and a material grade, Crossan said, his gray eyes locking onto mine. Richard, who wrote this portfolio. Richard Croft stood up, his face the color of old paper. Dieter, I assure you, Victoria Vance is the lead designer of record. The files were uploaded under her digital profile. I do not care about a digital profile. Crossan slammed his open hand onto the walnut table, the sound detonating through the silent room like a structural weld snapping under pressure. I am an engineer, Croft. I built bridges in the Ruhr Valley for 20 years before I bought my father's company. I know what a line looks like when it is stolen. I want to know who calculated the wind-shear deflection for my atrium. Victoria looked at Croft. She looked at the senior partners. Her hands were shaking so violently that the gold-plated pointer slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble border of the floor and rolling until it hit the base of my chair. It was a collaborative effort, she whispered, her face chalk-white, her perfect chignon starting to loose as a strand of hair fell across her forehead. Lauren handled the data entry. She was my administrative assistant for the file compilation. Data entry? Crossan let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded like a saw hitting an iron spike. He looked down at the mahogany box sitting on my section of the table. Miss Ross, open your box. I reached forward. My fingers were cold but steady. I opened the brass hinges of the mahogany case and lifted out my father's parallel ruler, its graphite edges worn down by hours of contact with standard drafting vellum. Along the side of the polished wood, stamped into the grain with an old industrial iron, were the words, Property of N. ROSS, Chief Welder, Structural Union 402. The formula on page 242, Crossan said quietly, has a geometric spacing of exactly 0.75 millimeters between the stress lines. That is the exact tolerance of an N. Ross alignment tool. Miss Ross, stand up. I stood. My gray blazer was cheap compared to her charcoal wool, and my shoes didn't have gold buckles on them, but my spine was straight. My father had spent 40 years checking the alignment of beams that held up the city. He had taught me that a structural engineer doesn't hide behind a title when the load comes down. Tell me how you resolved the wind load deflection, Miss Ross, Crossan said. I didn't use the high tensile specification to force the balance, Mr. Crossan, I said, my voice clear, resonant, filling the boardroom without the aid of a microphone. I modified the truss geometry to create a secondary load path. When the wind hits the lakefront face of the third tower, the torsional energy is converted into compression forces that travel down the diagonal struts and dissipate directly into the subterranean concrete anchors. The grade 70 steel isn't the solution. It's simply the material that allows the geometry to function. Dieter Crossan stared at me for 5 seconds. Then he took off his reading glasses, folded them with a slow, deliberate click, and tucked them back into his breast pocket. That, Crossan said, looking back at Richard Croft, is an architect. Victoria Vance sank back into her black leather chair. She looked small. The cream silk shell of her blouse was damp with sweat, and her diamond earrings looked like pieces of broken glass under the boardroom lights. The architecture of her deception had failed. The columns had buckled, the cantilevers had given way, and she was left sitting in the wreckage of a promotion that had lasted exactly 14 hours. The walnut conference table felt as long as a runway. Managing partner Richard Croft sat frozen, his fingers frozen over a gold fountain pen, while Victoria Vance stared at the blue schematic line radiating across the room like a crack in a high-pressure dam. We need a temporary recess, Croft said, his boardroom baritone cracking as he scrambled for a tactical retreat. Clearly, there has been an administrative miscommunication regarding the file allocation inside our creative suite. Vanguard handles hundreds of complex municipal and international filings simultaneously, Mr. Crossan. A clerical overlap in the metadata tagging does not. The overlap is not in the computer, Croft, Dieter Crossan interrupted, his hands sliding deep into his trouser pockets as he paced the length of the glass wall. The overlap is in your executive suite. I do not do business with firms that require an assistant to translate their own signature designs. This sign-off session is concluded. Dieter, please, Victoria whispered. She reached out, her fingers tracking across the black leather binder of the portfolio, trying to pull the 300-page document closer to her chest, as if she could hide the missing mathematics behind the premium heavyweight paper. The conceptual framing, the entire aesthetic energy of that riverfront wedge, belongs to my creative vision. Lauren was simply the drafting hand. She executed the mechanical details under my direct structural oversight. Dieter Crossan stopped packing. He turned slowly, his face flat and hard as a granite ledger. He looked down at Victoria, then at the platinum architectural compass pinned to her lapel. Then explain Clause 7 on page 184, Miss Vance, Crossan said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, clinical hush. The specific formula regarding the load-bearing balance of the glass atrium wall. If you oversaw the structure, you can tell me the baseline threshold for the thermal tension joints without looking at your notes. Victoria opened her mouth, but her tongue seemed to fail her. Her eyes darted down to her laminated index cards, but I had deliberately excluded the thermal tension equations from her summary decks 3 weeks ago. She had no notes for page 184. She had no vocabulary words to rescue her. It is managed by the expansion tolerances of the structural frames, she stammered, her gaze shifting frantically around the room, looking for a senior partner who would jump into the line of fire for her. None of them moved. Richard Croft was already sliding his own leather binder away from his chair, creating a distinct physical distance between his position and her buckling foundation. The expansion tolerance is an index, not a calculation, Crossan said, with quiet contempt. He looked across the table at his chief legal counsel, Elsa Brandt. Elsa, record that the Vanguard contract proposal is pulled on grounds of material misrepresentation of design authorship. We will reopen the bidding process on Monday morning with the Chicago Architectural Consortium. Mr. Crossan, I said, stepping forward from the back row. My voice was calm, measured, carrying the exact weight of my father's parallel ruler resting under my palm. The contract doesn't need to be pulled. The designs are fully compliant with the Crossan engineering criteria, the municipal zoning codes are locked, and the structural integrity has already been certified by a licensed professional. Crossan turned his gray eyes back to me. Certified by whom, Miss Ross? The title block says Victoria Vance. I reached into my cheap leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. Stamped with a blue ink seal that had been notarized at 8:30 the previous evening, 4 hours before Victoria Vance had accepted her Crystal Award at the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. The master schematics were recorded under the State Architectural Registry on April 15th, I said, sliding the document across the walnut veneer until it rested directly in front of Crossan's reading glasses. The intellectual property filing includes the raw vector coordinates, the complete finite element analysis calculations, and my personal seal as a licensed structural engineer in the state of Illinois. File number 2026, SE 9041. Victoria Vance didn't sign the legal drawings. She signed the marketing covers. Dieter Crossan picked up the sheet. He studied the blue ink seal, his thumb tracing the raised edge of the notary stamp exactly the way he had traced the wood grain of my father's ruler. A slow, genuine smile broke through his silver beard, the first real warmth I had seen on his face in 2 days of meetings. Croft, Crossan said, not looking up from the paper. Your senior vice president of creative assets is a very expensive wallpaper designer. If you want the Crossan Corporation's $92 million, you will restructure this contract within the hour. Miss Ross will be listed as principal architect of record. She will handle the structural execution with an independent budget, and her signature will be the only one on the final engineering waivers. Richard Croft stood up, his face shifting from terror to immediate, predatory compliance. Of course, Dieter. Vanguard prides itself on recognizing raw engineering talent. We can draft an internal structural writer immediately. Not a writer, I said, looking straight at Croft. A new employment covenant, partner track, full design equity for the Riverline development, and the immediate termination of Victoria Vance from the creative division for corporate asset theft. The room went completely shadowless. Victoria Vance shot to her feet, her chair flying backward until it hit the wood molding of the wall with a loud, hollow crash. "Lauren, you ungrateful, backstabbing." "The columns are down, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice level, my spine straight as an unyielding tirade. "You shouldn't have left your file-stripping history on the shared project server. It took the IT auditor exactly 10 minutes to find your Christmas Eve deletion logs." The corporate extraction was quiet. By 2:00 p.m. that afternoon, Victoria Vance's office smelled only of the jasmine tea she had left behind in her rush to escape the 42nd floor. A security guard stood near her door with 2 brown cardboard boxes, watching as a junior administrative assistant cleared out the white leather chairs, the Swiss interior design certificates, and the porcelain teacups that had never seen a single day of fieldwork. She wasn't fired with a public announcement. That wasn't the Vanguard way. She was allowed to submit a formal resignation based on personal health considerations and a desire to focus on independent philanthropic pursuits. But the regional business journals ran the contract adjustment on Wednesday morning. Vanguard restructures Riverline leadership. Lauren Ross named principal structural architect on $92 M anchor project. My father called me from his small kitchen in South Chicago at 6:30 that evening. I could hear the rhythmic clinking of his dinner dishes being stacked into the sink, the background drone of the local news channel running its weather forecast. "Lauren," he said, his voice thick, carrying that heavy industrial rasp that 40 years of welding smoke leaves behind in a man's chest. "I saw the paper downtown. They printed the name block clear as a blueprint. Lauren Ross, SC. They used the alignment math, Dad," I said, sitting at my desk with my fingers resting on the polished wood of his mahogany box. "The one we checked on the kitchen floor in October." He was silent for 4 long seconds. I knew what he was doing. He was wiping his safety glasses with his handkerchief, his hands shaking just slightly under the kitchen light, because he was a man who didn't know how to deliver a compliment without feeling like he was bending a structural beam. "Your mother would have kept that paper on the fridge until the ink wore off," he said quietly. "The line didn't lie, did it, Franny?" "Never, Dad," I said. The senior partners at Vanguard didn't become my friends. They were corporate managers. They respected the $92 million, not the girl who had calculated the cantilevers. But they stopped calling me into the copy room to bind their portfolios. When I walked into the 42nd floor boardroom the following Monday, Richard Croft stood up and pulled out my chair himself. The heavy black Italian leather one at the center of the table, directly beneath the panoramic view of the river I had claimed for my own.